Well, thank you very much for joining us all here tonight for the launch of By Violence Unavenged by Annette Young. I wish to thank Annette Young particularly for the high honour of being asked to launch her book, By Violence Unavenged, here at Gleebooks in Glebe. It is very good for me to be here in Sydney's inner west among friends and allies, given that I'm usually here to be the lone conservative on the ABC's radio and television programs. So it's good to be among friends here in the inner west. Readers of Annette's first book, A Distant Prospect, will read By Violence Unavenged with an expectation that there will be a considerable emphasis on the historic as well as upon, say, the musical and the artistic. It is a large undertaking, to be sure. It is hard to overstate, as one approaches By Violence Unavenged, that it covers events that, while still historic, emerged from historical events a century ago, but with which we still live now. We have never escaped from the Great War of 1914 to 1919 and its aftermath. That period after which a terrible war, a terrible global war, a terrible convulsion that destroyed societies. That period after 1919 when things only got worse, and which the former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, himself a veteran of the Great War, described later in his life as that time when the sense of peace and security, which in the course of this century has been taken from us. Readers of By Violence Unavenged should come to the book with some knowledge of what events have happened and have transpired before the book's narrative really gets going. Indeed, I would say that one should already know this material already. It is the story of you, it's the story of us, and it is the story of our ancestors. One of Annette's great strengths as a writer is she expresses her ideas in a manner that expects the reader to follow along and to keep up. And if in doubt, they should also do their research. In my view, too much literature these days, like too much of our politics, treats the reader as if they were a fool who cannot comprehend the recent past and what went before them. Thankfully, By Violence Unavenged, Annette's book, refuses to do this, and it instead takes us back to the First World War's end and its aftermath, a world that has both vanished and a world which is always still with us yet. The Great War's end and the Great War's chaotic aftermath are like a poltergeist that has been summoned by our ancestors and which we cannot ever exorcise. The centenary of that Great War, which has just passed us here in Australia, has given us a chance to re-examine that enormous and earth-changing conflict. Many of us had relatives and ancestors in the Great War. My own grandfather, Second Lieutenant James George Connolly, was not even 20 when he graduated from his Officer Cadet Battalion to join the British armies on the Western Front as a reinforcement for the final push in 1918. A young Catholic gentleman of the Dowie Abbey School, he was always found, I am told, at least in his cardigan and regimental tie, such that I am wearing a modern incarnation of that tie today in tribute. He would suffer all his life with survivor's guilt, for he only joined the war at the very end, and had this sense of guilt of many men of his era that he had survived. Sadly, my grandfather, whose own experience of this tumultuous time was so great, he would die a long time before I was born, and I never got to meet him. My grandfather did at least serve with Australians on the Western Front, and indeed so tumultuous was the First World War in terms of its consequences for British society, that when my grandfather turned 21, no one had 21st birthdays after the First World War. The idea of celebrating your 21st was considered to be in bad taste because so many people had lost their sons and brothers and fathers in the war. The idea that you would celebrate your 21st when so many had lost children and sons and brothers in their teens was considered to be quite not the done thing. So my grandfather, for example, got from his parents, they gave him as a present a trip to Australia to meet up with his Australian war comrades. And the end result of that for me was that my grandfather, one day when he had to go to Mass, being a Sunday, he was told by his friends, while they were not Catholic, there was a Catholic family across the road in Kew in Melbourne where they lived, and in that place was the daughter of the head of the household, who my grandfather would eventually marry, and hence we would come to Australia. So the war had large impacts for everyone, and not just my father. My great uncles served with the Honourable Artillery Company and the Royal Garrison Artillery on the Western Front. I had a great uncle who was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, who was in the Russian expedition, which again touches on the events of Bi-Violence for Unavenged, the fall of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks. So, and this is just not my story, I doubt there's anyone in this room whose families were not affected, directly or indirectly, by the Great War and its catastrophic aftermath. All of this era of Bi-Violence Unavenged was experienced by our grandparents. All of this history bears on us now, and all of it bears especially on this book. Annette's Bi-Violence Unavenged is set mainly in Austria, but its canvas, its background, its tableau, is really that torn world of Middle Europa. The bloodlands, as one American historian put it, from the Rhine River eastwards to the Dnieper River. It is important to understand the Austrian and the Habsburg mindset. From Imperial Vienna, one looks west to the revolutionary and the decatholised France with disdain. One looks north to Germany with trepidation. One looks east to Russia with both concerns but also historic thoughts of the Holy Alliance. And an Austrian always looks south to the Ottomans with the experience of almost perpetual warfare with the Sultan. Indeed, if you were one of the characters in Annette's book, or one of your ancestors, and someone told them in 1912 that by 1922, the elapse of only 10 years, that within those 10 years, the Tsar of Russia, the two Kaisers, the Kaiser of Germany and the Kaiser of Austria-Hungary, and the Sultan of the Ottomans would either be dead or deposed and in exile, you would never have believed it. You would never have believed that in the space of 10 years, even less than that really, from 1914 onwards, the idea that the Tsar and the Kaisers of Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Sultan of the Ottomans would all be either dead or in exile. That was an idea that you would never, ever have believed. Yet, that is exactly what happened as a result of the Great War of 1914 to 1919. And so we come to the armistice of November 11th, 1918, and all that followed afterwards. The Allies barely surviving themselves, they had won the war. The price of the Allies' peace, particularly for the British Empire, was to accept being spurred on by the frankly insane demands of the American President Woodrow Wilson, himself a product of the old American South's prejudices and a certain low church provincialism and bigotry. His demand, Wilson, his demand was the end of the old monarchies. And in the case of Austria-Hungary, tragically, the dissolution of a polyglot empire in which people of very different ethnicities, religions, cultures and the like had at least shared an empire together with a common allegiance. It was not perfect, but it was certainly much better than everything that was to follow. Wilson's demand at the end of the First World War, his 14 points, were effectively to transpose the ideas of the American founding to Europe, as if the sense and moderation of an Alexander Hamilton would be shared among the European masses who had just endured 5 years of the most brutal war then experienced. Wilson wanted to play tutor to the victors and to the vanquished. Wilson wanted a wholly new Europe, seemingly unaware that his own country's republic emerged from a revolution that had led to a gruesome civil war, which was fought over the question ultimately of whether some people were to be counted as 3/5 of a human being. This was the person who set himself up to be the tutor to the Europeans at the end of the First World War. The frustrations by 1919 with Wilson's delusions were such that in February of 1919, the Governor-General of Australia, Sir Ronald Munro Wilson, was poised to write to the commander of the British Army on the Western Front, General Sir William Birdwood, who'd himself been a commander of the Anzacs. And Munro Ferguson said this: "One wonders how much longer an exhausted world will bear with the delays in coming to a peace settlement which are due to President Wilson and his insistence on organising a new heaven before the wounds and the hurts of the old earth have been repaired. Sadly, they were not to wait for very long. The period from 1919 onwards was one where there was only but the steady destruction of the old world and its civilization, and the replacement of those two Kaisers and the Sultan by the Wilsonian settlement based upon self-determination and democracy, but which would lead ultimately to racialist policies and petty tyrannies. On June 28th of 1919, the Versailles Treaty would be imposed upon the vanquished Germans in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The Weimar Republic would replace temporarily the Hohenzollerns, but soon the Republic would give way to the Nazis. On September the 10th of 1919, the Treaty of Saint-Germain would be imposed upon the Austrians. The Habsburgs would be banished from the historic domains which they had ruled for seemingly ever, and the once great Imperial Austrian armies, which had defended Christendom from the Turks and the European civilization from the revolutionary French, those great Austrian armies would be no more either. A republic would emerge, and that republic would be no more stable than the Weimar one. And on the 4th of June 1920, the Treaty of Trianon, one of the most appalling treaties in the history of public international law, was imposed, again at Versailles, upon the Hungarians, separating vast numbers of Magyar speakers from each other. That very unique, special, beautiful, but somewhat exotic Magyar language, spoken only by the Hungarians. They would be separated out from what was once the Kingdom of Hungary into all manner of ersatz republics, is there really any other kind, and kingdoms that would be known mostly in succeeding years as the vassal states of the Nazis and of the Soviets. When the Allies tried this sort of behaviour on the Turks at the Treaty of Severus, seeking to dismember the Ottoman Empire in August of 1920, the Turks, at least to their credit, fought. The problem with the Turks, as always, is who they fought. The problem was that the Turks fought the Greeks and the Armenians, often in a campaign that included acts of war crimes, if not outright genocide, such that to this day we live with the consequences no less of Severus than our ancestors did with Versailles, not just of the enmity between the Greeks and the Turks, but between the Kurds and the Turks and the Arabs. It is hard to think a century on of how the supposedly victorious Allies, driven by the frankly insane President Wilson, could have done a worse job than the one they did at Versailles and elsewhere to ruin the victory that people like my grandfather, my great-uncles, and no doubt your grandfathers and great-uncles had won at such enormous cost. It is difficult to imagine also how many more seeds of future war could have been planted by Wilson and his ilk. Both European and American liberalism shared in 1919, as they do now, a messianic belief in progress and good intentions that is utterly impervious to geography, to history, to religion and to culture, or to what we may call facts. They were societies from Germany to Austria to Middle Europa to Turkey to the Middle East that were ripped apart from top to bottom. The Russian Revolution would become a civil war. The Russian liberal revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, like President Wilson, a delusional liberal intellectual who'd been stupidly given power, Kerensky toppled the Tsar but had no stomach for the Bolshevik onslaught that was to come. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their family, their loyal household would be murdered by the Bolsheviks. Former Tsarist officers and noblemen, once proud men of rank and position in Russian society, would very soon after be found driving taxis and waiting on tables in Paris and in London. And some white Russians would come to Sydney to start the cafe society that we have today. Very much the cafe culture we have in Sydney today is a result of white Russians fleeing their homeland a century ago. The only moral to this story is that when Alexander Kerensky finally died, no one would bury him. In many respects, the unwillingness of anyone to bury Kerensky after all the destruction that he brought on his peoples is in some respects an epitaph upon liberalism itself. The former veterans of the Kaiser's army at this time would fight on against the Bolsheviks in the Baltics, or they would be found begging in the streets of Berlin and Munich. In 10 years' time after this, they would, very many of them, would form the bulwark of the steel helmet movement, which subsequently would sweep Hitler into power. The Hungarians would also have their realm taken over by the communists, by Bela Kun's Red Terror. which would, in its brief period in 1919 of rule over Hungary, would kill thousands. And it would only be driven out by Admiral Nicholas Horthy's White Army, which would then lead to a period of retaliatory White Terror. That so much of Budapest's beauty still stands now, despite this history of brutality, was because, as Horthy said, its beauty had saved it despite its communistic sins. But the focus of By Violence Unavenged is on Austria, and on Austria's desire to heal the wounds of the Great War. There is a sense in By Violence Unavenged of Vienna trying to keep up appearances. This once great city, this once great civilization, which had been stripped by the First World War and by the terrible treatment in the Treaty of Saint-Germain, that Vienna was trying to hold up together this once great imperial tradition, and was almost having to accept that where once it had been the capital of this great and polyglot empire, Vienna now was merely just a museum of what was once and yet still might be. It is in this sense of the polyglot that By Violence Unavenged keeps returning to, through the tumultuous events of Austrian history that form the backdrop. Annette has done brilliantly here. The Austrian loss in World War I, the deprivation of empire, the failure of its republic, the Nazi destabilisation and assassinations, and finally the tragedy and shame of the Anschluss. There's this sense of Austrians trying to keep their culture and their civilization together, knowing almost that it was hopeless. It brings to mind the phrase of the great British historian Richard Overy when describing the interwar period. He called it the morbid age, almost as if everyone knew what was being attempted was doomed. And the wounded Austria, limping through the 1920s and the shock of Austria's new existence as this small state that is a remnant of now faded glories, that it is trying to endure the shock of defeat, then of the depression, the hopes of the chancellorship of Engelbert Dollfuss, the Christian fatherland leader who had helped Austria resist the brutalities of Soviet communism and resist the lures and threat of Nazi Germany to the north. By Violence Unavenged has this very real sense of this foreboding, this morbidity, this sense of Austria struggling with all its might against the doom that it had almost been consigned to it by the end of the First World War and by the settlements and the cultural nihilism that had been unleashed therein. The assassination by the Nazis of Dollfuss in 1934 and the unsuccessful premierships that followed him, of Starrenberg, who would actually flee Austria when the Nazis take over the Anschluss, and he would be found fighting for the British and the Free French in the Second World War, and of Schuschnigg, the final chancellor of a free Austria, who the Nazis would later arrest and keep in concentration camps for the duration of the Second World War. This sense is very strong throughout the book of the Austrians fighting valiantly, even if in a hopeless cause. This idea that we hold on to civilization, come what may. The loss of the true and royal Catholic Austria, in particular the Habsburg Austria and its mixture of ethnicities and cultures, to the Nazi rule, the Nazis who built their brute racialism on the legacy of Martin Luther's Germany, is one of the most saddening aspects of By Violence Unavenged. The protest in January 1938 of that final Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, is a form of coda to the book. Schuschnigg said, "An absolute abyss separates Austria from Nazism. We reject uniformity and centralisation. Christendom is anchored in our very soil, and we know but one God, and that is not the state, or the nation, or that elusive thing, race." The end of Annette's book and stark depiction of the persecution of Austrian Jews by the Germans who had crushed the old Austria is poignant and it is sad. One cannot overstate what destruction the Nazis had wrought in little over a year. The old Austria that the Habsburgs had spent centuries building, and which had been the bulwark of Christendom against the Ottomans' brutal expansion, was dismantled by the Allies after the Great War and then obliterated by the pagan racialism of the Nazi Anschluss in 1938. This was not a story that ends with the Von Trapps nobly escaping over the Alps to some fictional refuge, but rather a sordid history of not just By Violence Unavenged, but of a historic injustice that continues on to this day. It is the cry found on page 238 at the end of chapter 36, where this is said, "We are Austrians, and to be Austrian is to be deeply Catholic, and to be deeply Catholic is to possess the fullness of truth and to embrace all people in faith and hope and love. That is what it means to be universal. And when we say, Austria est imperare orbe universo, that is what we mean. Austria is nailed to the cross of Christ with one arm extended to the east and the other to the west. She has nothing to do with German tyranny. We will never be German. I will never be German." All in all, the tale told in By Violence Unavenged was and is the tale of tens of millions of people doing their best to cope against forces they could not control and to which they should never ever have been made subject. The folly and the inanity, the idiocy, the ahistoricity of the victor's peace of 1919 and its terrible injustices to the vanquished and the destructive impulses of so many Western liberal idiocies were themselves avenged, but against the innocence of Middle Europa that Annette Young's book, By Violence Unavenged, chronicles so thoroughly. It is now thus my great pleasure to launch By Violence Unavenged and to commend it to the broadest possible region. Thank you.